Are you sure you're not eating chips?
Pretty sure.
Okay, you're listening to Vassals of Kingsgrave. In this episode, Brian and I will break down the Deeper Than Swords exhibit, celebrating the works of George R.R. Martin that is taking place right now at Texas A&M University. And this podcast does contain spoilers to all published works of A Song of Ice and Fire and the Dunk and Egg novellas. So, Brian, we took a road trip this past week.
Yes, we did.
Solid. So let's go ahead and just basically recount our experience, what we thought of the Martin exhibit and all that stuff in brutal, gory detail, starting with the ride down there. So we left from Dallas. Brian and I live around the North Texas area, and we had a nice 3-hour long road trip down to College Station. So what were your thoughts on the first 30 minutes of the drive?
What?
Your thoughts on the first 30 minutes of the drive down there?
Yeah. I didn't take any notes. I was driving, so I don't have any notes of my thoughts.
Okay. Well, let's just skip ahead then. What were your expectations of the exhibit?
I didn't really know what to expect. I guess probably sometime last January or somewhere around there, you had mentioned that this exhibit was coming to A&M, which obviously intrigued me for two reasons. One, being a fan of the Song of Ice and Fire, and therefore George R.R. Martin, and then also the fact that since we went to Texas A&M, it was kind of in my mind at least a little bit anachronistic. Just those two things going together. And I know at the time you had mentioned that you had mentioned in the context of the kind of the grand opening event of the exhibit where George was actually going to be there, and we were looking at possibly going down for that, but then something came up and we weren't able to go.
Right. They were going to do a whole kickoff with a free lecture at A&M, free entrance into the exhibit, a book signing, and on top of that, they were doing the Feast of Ice and Fire stuff, they had a bunch of food coming out of the Feast of Ice and Fire cookbook, which is awesome. So I was really excited for it and kind of a little disappointed when we weren't able to get down there for it. But we said, hey, the exhibit's going to be there for a few months. We just got to make sure we get down there at some point.
Right. So at the time, I didn't look into it or anything. I only went by information, just that you had told me. And at first I thought maybe it was like a moving exhibit, like it had been somewhere and then it was moving A&M and then it would go whatever. That was just like my first thought. And I was like, no, that's probably not the case. And I just thought, whatever, that it was just some random kind of capitalizing on the whole Game of Thrones popularity and everything. And so I really had no idea what to expect. And then last week when we were getting ready to go down there, I actually, went and looked up some information, which, that's where we first found out that our plan originally was to go on Saturday, and we found out that it wasn't open on the weekends. But that's when I actually looked and found out, had no idea, had been, went to A&M for, quite a while. But, obviously didn't have any idea, well, maybe not obviously, but I didn't have any idea who George R. R. Martin was at the time. But had no idea that, that since 1993, that's where he's kept his manuscripts. Donated all of his manuscripts up through that point and his notes and everything, and then has continued to keep providing documents there, which, was just, again, it was a weird kind of collision of two things in my life that wouldn't have expected to kind of collide. So,
right. Like, I got into the Song of Ice and Fire books, I wouldn't say late, but late, basically. And it was after I had finished going to school at Texas A&M. Yeah, I had no idea the exhibit was there. I had no idea, the exhibit wasn't there at that point, but I had no idea he kept his manuscripts there. I didn't know there was as much stuff there as we found out later in the exhibit. It's not just the works of George R. R. Martin that are kept there at A&M. There's a lot of other stuff, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But yeah, at the time when I was looking into this, I thought it was mostly things that were just kind of a derivative of the books, meaning like works of art or things that were inspired by, or paintings, portraits, all that sort of stuff. I didn't know there was going to be so much original content created by George himself on exhibit.
Right.
And so that was when we started actually looking into it and doing some research. I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. And still, I didn't know what to expect because I didn't know how big the exhibit hall was. I didn't know if we'd walk into something, just like a tiny, like an enlarged closet and be like, here's a bunch of, books, or here's a bunch of stacks of boxes. But when we walked in, it was actually really nice, like a good size little exhibit hall. And it wasn't huge or anything, but there's lots of actual content to dig into there.
Right. No, I agree. I had the same kind of expectations in that I didn't think it was going to be I didn't expect it to be as much content beforehand. I really, completely agree with the expectations that you had.
So it's all actually in the Cushing Library at A&M. It's open Monday through Friday. It's free admission. And we basically walked across campus, swung by a couple of our old haunts, and then went up to the Cushing Library. And I've kind of forgotten what a lot of old buildings are like, because up in Dallas, as soon as something gets old, we tear it down. Nowadays, there's, a lot of space kind of built into buildings to kind of, you have this, the entranceway or the foyer or whatever, and then the receptionist desk is you kind of walk through a door and you can see it out in front of you. And a lot of old buildings, it's like you don't mess around with any of that. You just walk in and everything's just right there. And that's kind of how you walk into this building. You walk up some steps, and immediately they have a easel set up with like a poster or poster board of the exhibit, like right in front of you. Immediately grabs your attention, and I just started fixating on that and completely ignoring the nice lady working the receptionist desk to my right, because it's just right there the second you walk in. And after a brief but awkward interaction, we ascertained that the exhibit is upstairs. We can't take our bags in. I had brought a camera, and I'll put some pictures up on the forums. If you're listening to this and not a member of the podcast of Ice and Fire forums, then you should be. But I'll put some pictures up there, and we figure out that the exhibit's upstairs. We get kind of direction to head up that way, and pretty much we were kind of the only ones in there for a while. There were some people that were kind of perusing through later. Yeah, we just took the elevator up, and it just immediately opens into the exhibit hall.
Yeah, I really was expecting to go up there and when we got off the elevator, have to walk down a hallway, kind of like what you were saying when we first walked into the building. But yeah, we step out, and it's all of a sudden, everything it's not a big room, kind of a decent sized room, but not, anything huge. But we're greeted with, faces that, at least on some level, we're familiar with. There were, one glance around, you could tell you were in a world of Song and Ice and Fire.
Yeah. When you walk in, immediately there's a print of Jon Snow and Ghost on the wall, and kind of a couple of poster boards with kind of articles and kind of giving a summary of what the exhibit is and what the kind of point of this all is. And so you're like, okay, great. Like, this is, I can kind of bound myself a little bit. I can kind of ground myself and then kind of go from this point, because all of it's just sort of laid out. It's not like it's not like something you'd see at like a museum or anything like that, or where they kind of step you through a process like, you have to go from point A to point B. You can just sort of wander. I guess, what was the first thing when you walked in, Brian, that caught your eye? Was it the portraits kind of on the wall? Was it the artwork, or was it the big display cases they had out there?
No, it was pretty much the big display cases. You kind of saw the artwork. Oddly enough, it didn't jump out to me right away, like the sword and the Warhammer that were right up on the wall, even though they were very, obvious. But that wasn't what jumped at, that wasn't what was noticeable to me, it was really, like the cases, the display cases that they had.
See, the sword was ice, and it wasn't the Game of Thrones version. It was the actual book version, which was made by Valerian Steel. So I knew about the sword going in. That was like one of the few things I actually did know coming in, was that, cool, I'm going to get a picture with ice. And when I say I'm going to get a picture with ice, I was like, I'm going to get a picture holding ice. And they had many signs saying, please do not touch the very sharp sword. It is an actual real sword. It is not a toy. Do not touch. And I might have taken a glance around to look at security cameras to make sure that, oh yes, someone would actually see me if I tried to grab this thing off the wall. And if I would have grabbed it off the wall, I probably would have cut through a display case and really created a disaster. So,
yeah, since we're on the sword, one thing that did jump out to me, not immediately, but when I got around to looking at everything, is that they have Robert's Warhammer, and I was slightly underwhelmed by the Warhammer, personally, only in the sense that, I mean, it looked pretty badass, and it definitely looked like something I would fear on the field of battle, but at the same time, when the descriptions talk about how heavy it was and just so massive, and Robert, was one of the few strong enough to wield it. It didn't have that look to it, like it was.
Yeah, it seems like I could walk up and pick it up, and I mean, maybe it's something that is kind of akin to like Thor's hammer, where you expect that, no, this is, if I tried to lift that, I would throw my back out or it just go crashing to the floor, and it didn't have that sense of heft or weight. Or, I mean, the sword ice was more imposing than the Warhammer to me.
Yeah, definitely.
One of the things, like they did something really interesting, since we were talking about the pictures of the prints of the portraits on the wall. They had images from the Song of Ice and Fire calendar, the one that's done by and I'm gonna completely murder this guy's name, John Picacio. I don't know. It's Picacio, and I was not an English major, so I don't know. But the guy that did.
I don't know that it's an English name, so I don't know that being an English major would help you with pronouncing it.
No, it's a good point, but I'm trying to hold myself to a high standard here and pronounce names correctly. Oh shit, I can't. Damn it. Anyway, that was really cool because it wasn't just the prints of that stuff. It was actually like some of his sketches, some of his working sketches. It was actually stuff that he had created, like the actual genuine article, which I thought was really cool. And so if anyone's a fan of that stuff, it was just cool to kind of see some of the processes there. And then kind of as a bit of a kind of compare and contrast, they also had commissioned an artist to kind of do a separate artist to do her own portraits of some of the characters. So there was a portrait of Tyrion just done in black and white, and a portrait of Arya that was just done in black and white, that I thought were really interesting because it was just another version of someone else's interpretations of the characters. I thought that was really interesting because they just look very different to me. Not anything like you'd see, like not the Peter Dinklage Tyrion, not exactly George R. R. Martin's Tyrion, just kind of someone else's interpretation, which I think is always interesting to see.
Right. If I remember correctly, the stuff from John Picacio, or however you pronounce his name, it's all from the 2012 calendar.
Yes.
Like he's the one who did the calendar artwork. So he didn't do it original for this exhibit, but he gave permission for them to use it. And then the other, the woman artist, actually, I believe, did the art, actually did original work for the exhibit.
Yeah, if I wasn't clear, like there's some of his sketches which are original, but from what I can understand, he does a lot of his coloring in digitally, and so that's why you don't really see, they didn't have a quote unquote original. And I can say the other artist's name. I think I'm going to try Evangeline Owen. So I thought her portrait of Arya was really interesting, just because it actually was kind of interesting. Like Arya's wearing like a dress of some sort with, it kind of has like some sort of I don't know the exact term, but it is not something that we typically see Ari in. And the disdain on her face for being put in that situation of having to like sit for a portrait, I thought was very noticeable and almost palatable coming off the painting.
Right.
So after you kind of adjust and you've kind of made around the periphery of the exhibit hall and kind of checked out some of the portraits, right in front they had 4, I think it was 4, it might have been 5, big glass cases that actually were dedicated to each of the books. And so right there, as soon as you walk in, there's a glass case that shows like pages of George's original like manuscript of Game of Thrones. And so it basically gives a summary and a timeline of when the book came out, how it was received, where some of the first like publications of that book were shown. Like I had no idea that Daenerys' story was condensed into kind of a novella and basically published in one of the like Isaac Asimov like science fiction serials or whatever. And to me, that was really, really cool.
And that was prior to Game of Thrones being published. That the condensed version was what I forget what they called it.
It was called Blood of the Dragon.
Yeah, but it actually came out prior to Game of Thrones being published. I forget if it was like a couple of months before, which is interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. I had no idea, and it kind of gave me a little bit of an appreciation of the different things that, you know, an artist or a writer, especially in this case, does to kind of promote, and all the things that you have to do to try to get your work out there. Because a lot of times, just in a general sense, if I'm thinking about like movies or scripts or music, there's all these different concessions that are sometimes made for different reasons of the actual end product or the art. And I kind of always view like, well, like a painter or a writer, like if you are not trying to write for a movie or not trying to write for a TV show, you're going to have complete control over your work and how it's presented. And just to kind of see very quickly in that first thing, like, well, actually, no, in a sense, you do have to, there's still different things that you can do and different things you can be asked to do to kind of promote and build an audience for your material. And I'm not saying that George, like, you know, in any way, George Martin's work was diminished by like a Daenerys, you know, novella or anything like that, or that he didn't want to do that or didn't, you know, or was forced into it or anything. I just thought it was interesting that I kind of view the books as like this complete entity where everything is set and everything works so well that you would not want to mess with that at all. And there you have like something, just one segment of the story completely removed and kind of just for consumption by itself.
Right.
And that just to me I was kind of really surprised to see that. I had no idea that was out there.
I had actually heard about that, and I think it was back, just as a little bit of backstory, you know, Travis, you really got me into, like, you introduced me to the whole world of, you know, the Song of Ice and Fire prior to Game of Thrones, but I didn't start reading anything until basically right when Game of Thrones came out. And I'm one who, I like to avoid spoilers, but on the other hand, like I also I like to gather information. You know, like when I first jump into something, you know, so I'm real careful to not get ahead. Although there's definitely things that there were things I got spoiled on, things like that. But one of the first things I did was go to, you know, Wikipedia and be like, what is this Game of Thrones thing? What is this Song of Ice and Fire thing? And at the time, I didn't know that there were 5 books out or whatever. And that was one of the first things that I read was like this, that there was this Daenerys like excerpted, you know, storyline that was published separately, which I didn't have any context for at the time. I do remember, you know, seeing that. But another thing too, you talk about like the creative aspects and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, I think everybody's really familiar with the story of the way things were broken apart in book 4 and 5, and, you know, how even some parts of book 5 have been pushed into book 6. But that started with the Game of Thrones. And that was one of the things that the exhibit talked about, was that the first few chapters of Clash of Kings, I don't remember how many, but the first few chapters of that were actually originally part of Game of Thrones. And, obviously most people probably know the story about that originally George envisioned it as a trilogy, Game of Thrones being the first book, Dance of Dragon, I think, was going to be the second book, and Winds of Winter was going to be the name of the third book. But yeah, like, it's interesting that, these things that obviously have become a part of it during these 5-year waits and everything, everybody knows about that. But it's really interesting that a lot of that started with the very first, from the very first book.
Yeah, that was what was most interesting to me, and why book readers, this is like, to me, I think if you have the opportunity to go and check this thing out, you absolutely should, because I love digging into the process. I love the behind the music, but for everything, behind the scenes, behind the music, and in this case, sort of like a behind the cover of how the product that everyone is such a huge fan of ended up coming actually into being. And stuff is crazy, as like one of the items in that first display case is the first manuscript, or the first go through of the place where John gives Needle to Arya. And the first time, in George's first pass of that, the iconic line, "Stick 'em with the pointy end," is actually not in it. And it's very interesting to read through that scene and be like, wait a minute. And then they have it side by side, at a different, a different revision, or a different pass through, where the line is in there. And it's just something that has gone to be such a, it's on T-shirts now. It was, The Pointy End was the title of an episode of the HBO show. And to think that originally that wasn't in there, that's kind of crazy to me. It's just, and it's such a small thing, but it kind of blew my mind of how much can change over the course of editing and writing and rewriting.
I agree. That was one of the things. That was a really neat part, was those two manuscript pages side by side.
Yeah, can you hold on one second? I'm going to grab my camera because I took some pictures and I want to kind of thumb through them as we're talking here.
Yeah.
Oh, something I probably forgot to mention when we were walking up to the library that I just thought was really cool. I actually tweeted out a picture of it, and I meant to mention it earlier, but we can bounce around a little bit here, is the gigantic banners that they have hanging from the top of the library. Black banners, so there's just a lot of white text on black background showing the Deeper Than Swords exhibit. In no uncertain terms, George R. R. Martin's name is all over it. So I just thought it was cool to see that sort of stuff have a presence on campus. I just thought that was really cool.
Yeah, that actually raises something that I had the thought of both when we were in the exhibit and since then is the title of the exhibit, is whether it's I go back and forth between it being a name like that actually has some meaning to it or whatever, or just a name that sounds very Games of Thrones-y, like just people sitting around saying, we got to come up with a name that sounds like it's from Song of Ice and Fire, and they just start throwing out, and somebody's like, Deeper Than Swords, and then everybody's like, that's it, that's perfect, but without necessarily a whole lot of, hey, is this a good name or whatever. So,
well, I don't mean to one-up you here, but I do believe it's part of, the phrase Deeper Than Swords is from the books. And it's from the line, fear cuts deeper than swords. And so I think they just took the second half of that and said, boom, that's our exhibit name. But I guess it's still, but the question still remains of, regardless of, so maybe it's not people just throwing out like words or whatever, it's opening the book and pointing at phrases and being like, oh, here's a phrase. Or did they actually, because I think it's a name that could have some meaning behind it, could have some depth, like basically the idea that there's, more going on here than just, sword fighting, and, that's kind of your fantasy cliche. But I see what you're saying there. I gotcha. It's not just wizards and magic and dragons and stuff like that. It's actually it's deeper than that.
Right. Part of it is reading Martin there's a lot of times where you wonder if like something's intentional or not. But with Martin, because it happens so much in the books and so many things fall into place, you pretty much give the benefit of the doubt that if
Right.
something seems like it's got some meaning to it, then it probably does. But I don't I don't want to necessarily go too far or give too much credit. But at the same time, I also don't want to take any credit away from the people that put the exhibit together. And, you know, did they give that kind of thought, or did they just go, oh, this is a cool phrase?
Yeah. And it's kind of funny because I've had the discussions. My dad also reads the book. He's read all 5. And one of my favorite parts of kind of being a fan of the work is diving into all the crazy theories. I love the crazy theories. I love what it may or may not be foreshadowing. I love the fact that George in the writing is aware, you know, the line that, you know, prophecy is like a well-trained mule. You know, once you think it's going, you're, you know, working for you, it will turn around and kick you in the head. I kind of love that there's a lot of sort of inside the work kind of debunking some of that. Oh, well, it's not one, you know, is there one prince who was promised? Is there one Azor Ahai? Are there multiple people that could fit the prophecy at this point? And I like discussing that stuff and talking about it with my dad. He's just like, I don't know, man. I think he's just throwing a lot of stuff out there. And I'm like, no, you need to reread the books then, because I don't think he's just throwing stuff against the wall. He hasn't painted himself into a corner or anything like that. I'm not grasping at straws to try to make this stuff connect and find meaning. And so in that capacity, that would be pretty cool for the exhibit to actually be going off of that theme.
Yeah, so that's like basically what my thought process was, you know, of but my intent wasn't to it's not so much necessarily where the phrase comes from that I was thinking about, but yeah, like how much thought was actually put into, you know, the use of the name. So
yeah, well, I'm not trying to be a dick. Sorry, I wasn't trying to call you out. I mean, I guess I did, but I didn't mean to be a dick about it.
It's all right. I'm used to it.
Well, I just because of the irony and just kind of, you know, it might have been fun to, if we're taking lines from the book, it might have been fun to name the exhibit Words or Wind and just be really confusing. But we also, throughout the trip, also called it the Deeper Than S Words exhibit. So we may be misinterpreting this whole thing.
I agree.
And just combing through the books, like looking for different S words. Salt pans. Oh, well, maybe not. Maybe it's not that.
Huh.
Yeah. So maybe getting back on track, we were talking about the different little exhibit cases with everything they had, and it was really cool because they'd had, like we talked about, the Blood of the Dragon in the Game of Thrones case. There was also graphic novels in the Game of Thrones case. It was just really, really cool. Lots of different stuff. Some of the cases had board games, like the one from was it Fantasy Flight Games?
I believe so. The one that's discontinued, right? Is that the one, or is Fantasy Flight the one that's there? Because they had stuff from the original, like the one from like I think it was like 2004.
Yeah,
they had, and that was where they had the art proofs that I thought was really interesting.
Well, there was like there was one. I actually took a picture of it. Oh yeah, it is fantasy. It is Fantasy Flight. Yeah, it's 2003. It says either that or I'm completely wrong, which might be a possibility.
But it had it was clearly a copy that they had sent. I think we're talking about the same one, like that had artwork in it, had pictures, drawings, art of different characters that they had sent to George for his approval. And if I remember correctly, like Maester Lewin was on there, and and he had, seemingly had approved that. I think there was a Sansa, and then there was one that was labeled Catelyn, that was a very, very sexy Catelyn, first of all, and
sultry Catelyn.
Yes, and secondly was probably depicted the age correctly, technically, as to what's described, like what her age is. If I remember correctly in the book, she's, in her 30s. And so on that level, it was probably kind of consistent, but it also wasn't consistent because it, very much came across as like a young, hot Catelyn as opposed to a Catelyn with, that clearly has, not old, but has some years and wisdom and everything on her. That, and then obviously, more of like a kind of a noble, very, I don't want to say proper. That's not quite the right word, but this was, and actually the note from George, it was like very bolded or whatever of no, this is not Catelyn, and he said maybe it's Shay, and that was something that I thought was funny.
Yeah, that was, and I think we kind of mentioned this before, but like one of the most fun things about this was seeing the very close connection to George and his work, where this was stuff that was actively marked up. This was stuff that was, marked up by George or marked up by one of his friends who's doing the editing. And just to see his letters like, no, this is not the Lady of Winterfell.
That's right. Yeah.
No. Like, it said it like twice. And the second time, it was underlined. Yeah. And it was kind of like awesome.
Speaking, again, kind of not going in any particular order, but when you talk about like the notes on and seeing all that stuff, there was the one that I thought was kind of funny. I think it was Clash of Kings, but I'm not 100% sure about that. Where the editor basically said, commented on the use of ellipses, that he had used a lot of ellipses in the book. He's like, I don't remember Game of Thrones having this many ellipses. And I thought that was kind of, it kind of amusing just because it seems like it's the kind of thing I don't think of in terms of necessarily when people are editing, I think of editors either, checking for like basically doing proofreadings. And I realize that there's more that goes on there of like, hey, maybe you should change this, maybe you should cut this out or whatever. But it was very interesting to actually see it, see the notes to that effect.
And for those of us that don't write, maybe you want to explain some of those things because I didn't really understand what you just said.
Well, an ellipses would be like the 3 dots.
Okay, that's right. That's really funny. Now I get it. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, no problem.
One of the things that also we kind of mentioned some of the artwork before, but it's kind of also seeing the names and trying to tie some of the names together, the different people that have worked on it. We mentioned the guy that did the calendars and everything, but what I thought was awesome was there were some sketches of different things like weapons, something that I assume was the hill tribes, because there was basically some sketches and they kind of looked weirdly familiar, and they're actually done by John Howe, who did illustrations and concept work for Lord of the Ring movies. And this wasn't for Game of Thrones. This was artwork for either one of the games, or I think in this case it was actually illustrations for one of the limited edition Clash of Kings, like illustrations for the cover or in-book illustrations. And it was just really cool to see, people associated with these titans of fantasy literature contributing and kind of some sharing of talent. I just thought that was really awesome. I was like, holy crap, I'm looking at, actual like sketches of one of the guys that created the looks of Lord of the Rings, so the Peter Jackson movies, which was awesome.
One that I thought was cool was where they had, again, kind of like sketches like that were used for, basically to get George R. R. Martin's approval. And it was for one of the editions of the books that basically they were going to have, they had artwork at the top of each chapter, and like it wasn't like a scene or anything like that. It was one chapter might have a dagger up at the top, maybe like another chapter had something else, like just a little like very small image, not really portraying a part. I'm sure it tied into the chapter, but not portraying the chapter. And it was just on some level it's really obvious, but on another level it was just interesting to see like that's something that was sent to George for him to approve. That was something that I thought was really, interesting. Like it was fascinating to see that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and one of the illustrations by John Howe, I can only imagine was, because they didn't actually say it explicitly, I can only imagine it was different little concepts for the Lord of Bones, because it's this like sort of like wildling looking warrior, just with all these different versions of a skull helmet. Like one looks like it's from a saber-toothed tiger, another one looks like it's from a like a deer or a ram. One of them actually, his face mask is made of what looks to be like the pelvic bone of somebody, and it's just these really awesome illustrations, just like rough pencil drawings. And the thing that kind of makes it a little bit more awesome is the number of check marks by each one. Like they all have like one, some have one check mark, some have two, some have 4 or 5. Thought it was really interesting. And the one with the pelvic bone mask that I really liked only had 1 check mark, so that shows you what I know. It's kind of worth noting, Brian, you kind of mentioned like illustrations at the top of different chapters and things like that. Since this was a whole exhibit on the books and on literature, the actual books themselves they had there was really cool. Like if there are any book collectors out there, this was just awesome to see. Because I thought it was cool anyway. Oh, this is a first edition. This is one of 100 that was printed. This is a publisher's copy. This was a promotional copy. They had copies of books that actually had like hand-drawn illustrations in like, at the beginning of each chapter rather than just a print. And so it's like a treasure trove of these rare copies of the books. They had, the English version, like the British version and, the American version. Just really interesting to see, because I remember one of the first podcasts that I listened to, one of the early podcasts, the Song of Ice and Fire podcast, was breaking down all the different cover art for all these different books. And to actually go and see like, oh, I know that cover. I've seen that cover before. I haven't seen it in person, but there it is right in front of me. It was kind of cool.
Yeah, no, I agree. It was neat. And I'm sure we'll get into this more later, but when they had kind of the little side hallway, I thought it was really cool to see they had all these different foreign editions, foreign language editions and everything. And some of them, it was interesting to browse through. And, I have some limited like Spanish, and by extension of that, can pick up some like, some other languages. But it was interesting to see some where I could tell, which book it was, either by kind of deducing the title, or sometimes just because the artwork maybe was exactly like or very similar to the artwork for the versions that I've seen. But then there were ones that were definitely very, different. And I thought that was just really cool. I don't know. It's interesting the way things that like connect in my brain and stuff. And I tend to have like this one, image of something. So like, if somebody says to me Game of Thrones book, I'm picturing, a particular edition. Like that's what's in my head. That's my default. And that's the edition that like, that I want to have on my bookshelf. That's the edition that's the book. And I realize, obviously I know, and I'm exposed to the fact that like, the paperbacks and all that kind of stuff, and that expands it some. But then when you see like just this diverse array of versions of the book, it's really neat to see.
And that kind of goes along with the theme of what we were talking about earlier with some of the posters and everything, and something that you'll hear gripes about people with the casting of certain characters in the HBO shows, because there's so many different interpretations and so many different ways to visualize characters. And sure enough, there are certain features that we all want to see. There's certain things that we really identify, and to see it all in one place of these different versions is really cool. And so you see it in the illustrations of, well, this is what a knight looks like. This is what a knight riding horseback, where it just looks like your standard, more almost like that old English style knight with the banners and the standard, which looks a little bit different than what the HBO version shows. And to see that illustration too, we kind of talked about the portrait of Arya, but there was also a portrait of Daenerys. And so you had the image, the print of Daenerys from the 2012 calendar, which is just That's the one with her on horseback with the dragons circling above her. Very dynamic, very alluring. And then the portrait of her that was done by the other artist that was commissioned, and it was actually the painting itself, the original hanging there, was very much in stark contrast. Like the other ones, it was in black and white, but it still conveyed, I thought it was just a gorgeous picture. It was my favorite of the, I think they had 4 up around the exhibit hall of the actual paintings. It was my favorite of the 4. It conveyed something different about the character that I hadn't really seen. And I don't know if this is, I don't want to say like other versions of the Daenerys have been over sexualized or anything like that, but to me that portrait, the black and white portrait, was kind of had left a almost like a cold calculating. So kind of a lot of them show like different sides of the Daenerys, like either the fire or the kind of the freeing of slaves, that sort of liberating drive. But to me, this was more like cold and precise. And it may sound a little weird to people, but check out the pictures I'll put up, because I'm looking at the picture right now. So a podcast not being a visual medium, it's kind of hard to describe, but it might be described as calculating. It might be described as piercing, but I'll go ahead and put that up so people can see it too, because I really like it.
One thing that I thought was neat, and partially because I feel like on some level it's necessary. Like I didn't know going in, especially when I found out like that Martin's manuscripts that they're housed at A&M and everything. Like I didn't know, is this just going to be like essentially a puff piece kind of thing? And it was. I mean, it's definitely very few exhibits like this. Like, is it going to be anything critical like that? I wasn't expecting that. But what I did think was neat that they included in it was basically some, the things that have become very much a part of the, Song of Ice and Fire. And that's basically all the issues with time frames, delayed publishing, delayed books, the 5-year waits, that kind of thing. And that was definitely covered in this exhibit. I mean, I enjoyed that they had pulled out separate the excerpt from, book 4 from A Feast for Crows that said, "Meanwhile, back on the wall." And it, the page where it says, hey, wait a minute, I haven't seen these characters. And in there, George says, but, the next book that's coming out next year, you'll be able to see these characters. And, that was obviously written in 2005, and the next book didn't come out until 2010. Is that right? Or 2011, I guess.
Yeah, I think it was 11.
And I like the fact that they included that. Just because it is such a part of the whole saga, not an in-world part of the saga, but a real-world part of the saga.
Yeah, the fandom saga.
Yeah, and then they had the whole thing with Neil Gaiman's quote of George R. R. Martin is not your bitch. They actually had a big poster up on the wall, some type of artwork or whatever that said that very thing, and they explained the story with that.
They were basically showing some prints that were being done by a company. I'm sure they have a license or what have you in College Station of the different quotes and memorable lines from the book, like a mind needs books like a sword needs a whetstone. They have a print of all the names on Arya's prayer. Yeah, so lots of cool stuff that were expanding the content. And of course the George R. R. Martin is not your bitch.
Yeah.
And the best part about that is they had one of those little official, because they had these little placards or these little blurbs around everywhere to kind of explain what you're looking at. And so they actually have this little placard next to this print to explain the blog entry of Neil Gaiman back in 2009. And I know that because I'm looking at the little little cheat sheet. So that if people were not aware of that whole exchange, they can read up the history on it. So it's kind of funny that was basically some things that were happening outside of the works, outside of book releases, were kind of given a space on the wall, so to speak, to, if you want to get the whole experience, you got to know about the delays. So yeah, like I didn't think about that at the time, Brian, but it's a really good point that it's sort of like, this is his works, in a sense, warts and all, if you want to call them warts, of some of the, delays and things like that.
Right. Well, and then they talked about how, they included things like before Feast for Crows came out, they put out a like a little teaser, 5-chapter kind of release, that actually had like I don't know who it was released to, but it had basically the cover. I mean, it was the cover of like Storm of Swords, but it was just a little pamphlet kind of thing. And I think it was 5 chapters. But the interesting part of it is that either all or at least one of them was a Daenerys chapter. Basically, it was chapters that, or at least some of the chapters, didn't end up in the actual released book, and which is again, it's another thing going back to the idea that how much things change, even when it's at that point where it's almost about to be published. That clearly they made decisions about that pretty late in the process, because if they had known that, they definitely wouldn't have released it, including those extra chapters. So
Yeah.
And I actually looked it up, and it was it just included the first 3 Daenerys chapters, and then they were all moved to Dance.
I want to say those were from like promotional materials, either for like the publisher or for some, I don't know if it was for a convention or for something like that, some event.
Yeah, it was apparently Book Expo America.
Okay, there you go. Yeah, one of my favorite things, like seriously, because so much has been made of the gap, the delay between Dance with Dragons and A Feast for Crows. So much has been made of the decision that George was originally going to do a flashback, and then realized that just didn't work out, and that whole 5-year gap thing. And one of my favorite things in the exhibit, just because of the kind of wow factor, was in the Feast for Crows exhibit case, where they actually had a page of Daenerys' story, and it's sitting there. You're reading about a chapter from Daenerys, and it's sitting there, and it's got crows in the top left-hand corner of the page.
Yeah.
And so it was actually like, it's a chapter where she's dealing with murders of her soldiers by the Harpy in Marine, and it's just, I was like, man, that's crazy. That was originally part of the story. It says it right there. There's the title of the book, and we didn't see that for like 8 more years, or I don't know if it was 7 more years.
Right. I also had to be careful, because there was the one case that actually had and I think there may have been actually one other place with something too, but that actually have pages that are in Winds of Winter.
Right. In the middle, if you imagine cases, these different cases with each of the books, big square cases, and in the middle, like just like kind of satisfying any fantasy or sci-fi trope, where in the middle of the room is like the one critical element is a page from Winds of Winter. And I know a lot of stuff has been released or read at conventions or released online. I've stayed clear of any Winds of Winter spoilers, so to me this was just like, the forbidden fruit. It was right there. I could read it. I didn't have to go to a website. I didn't have to dig and find it or whatever. It was just right in front of my face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I might be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure there was also a page. There was also a page in the Dance of Dragons case that was a chapter, or not a chapter, but a page that was moved from Dance of Dragons into Winds of Winter. Whereas the one in the middle, I think, was always intended to be Winds of Winter.
Yeah,
because I think that I didn't really read it because I'm avoiding for the same reason. But the one in the middle of the room was, I believe, like a Sand Snakes type chapter. Somebody in that realm, definitely Dornish.
right.
And I think the one in the Dance of Dragons case was a Tyrion chapter.
Yeah, I didn't actually see the Tyrion chapter, but I'm glad I didn't. And because, some of the stuff that we saw there just kind of reinforces to me the idea of why I wouldn't want to read a quote-unquote spoiler chapter, because there were spoiler chapters out a long-ass time ago that were, this is just the new released Feast for Crows chapter. Great, I can read it now, then we're having to wait 2 years. And actually, that's not how the work ended up being put together. And so much can change even at this point, like unless George has got it all written up and he's just about to hit the print key. I'm kind of viewing this as the terms of like, I want to read the completed work when it's completed.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I will say, just for anybody who may happen to go, if they're at all worried and are trying to avoid, I definitely avoided reading or did my best to avoid reading, but I'm also I skim really well, so just my eyes crossing over it, I definitely picked up a fair amount from the page. And fortunately, neither of them had what I would at all consider like content. So lest anybody be worried about, oh, I don't want to go in there because I might accidentally pick up on some big spoilers for Winds of Winter. Well, technically, yes, spoilers. These are not, at least, I mean, I didn't examine them closely, but these are not chapters that are going to make you be like, oh, holy shit, this is crazy or anything like that. These are akin to the mini chapter or the mini pages that exist in any of the books where something fairly mundane is happening. So
What?
well, it all fits together into something that's not mundane, but the individual page is mundane.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know if I mentioned it. We've been mostly focused on all the content that was specifically for A Song of Ice and Fire in the books, but they did actually have a lot of stuff from the show as well. Like they had one of the little props, or I don't know if it was a prop or something you can actually buy, because I think I've seen it around the internet in different places, but basically a little quote-unquote survival kit for the Night's Watch, where they basically had a little tiny chest full of obsidian daggers and obsidian arrowheads and stuff like that. So they had some props from the show. Like they also had little, not so much props, but like things that were tied to the show. Like they had a little miniature version of the Iron Throne that was there in a display case, which was cool to see. They had some stuff that was given specifically to people that were working, like cast and crew type stuff. Like one thing in particular was a little glass. It wasn't more than about 4.5 inches big, like a little glass square that had kind of like the laser etched Iron Throne inside of it. And that was really cool. And so they had some kind of fun things like that. But for the most part, it was very much focused on the books, which I thought was good. And I think we've kind of talked about most of the stuff specific to the actual Song of Ice and Fire, but Brian mentioned earlier, like there's a whole another hallway that kind of expand kind of the scope of the exhibit. And it's not just about Song of Ice and Fire, it's all his work. So they had stuff on Wild Cards, they had stuff on Fever Dream, Dying of the Light. They had different books from different publishers and different international versions of those books as well, with the stories and kind of, when he wrote them. They had stuff in scripts that he had written. I think there was one from the Twilight Zone, again, like notes and things that were pulled together.
It was really organized as kind of a history of Martin's career, showing kind of his early works and, where he got started and kind of traveling through like the different parts of his career. Which I thought was really interesting. And it got me, I haven't read anything outside of the Song of Ice and Fire, and it definitely got me interested, or more interested than I was in reading some of his other stuff once I kind of get done with my current reread of Song of Ice and Fire.
Yeah, and I also thought when you say, speaking of history, they go as far back as they can to find something that was published of George. And the first thing in the case is a letter that he wrote that was published in an Avengers comic book way back in the day. And it's a story that has gotten out. It's been out in interviews, or I've seen articles on it before. But if you haven't heard, like George was a avid comic book reader and would write in talking about the issues that he liked and the different themes or what have you. And there's this little blurb from Fanboy George was writing into the Avengers comic book about what he thought was great and his favorite issue or what have you. And it's just kind of cool to see that sometimes the occasionally or borderline rabid enthusiasm that we and others have for his work is something that's not just contained to us. It's something that is kind of very much a human thing, and also especially for fans of the genre and some of the sci-fi stuff, you can get really passionate about it. And it's kind of cool to see that, one of the kind of titans of that genre right now still had that same sort of boyish enthusiasm. I mean, you can still see it today. Like, man, his victory lap after the Red Wedding aired, there was a lot of boyish enthusiasm, but it's just kind of cool to see it going back that far.
Yeah, I agree. It definitely, there were a number of things just when it talked about the different things that he got into in terms of writing, even Wild Cards, which I have I have not read at all. Definitely have heard some less than glowing reviews of it by people who are otherwise big Martin fans. But the part that was interesting to me about it, regardless of the level of quality or or how good it is, whatever, is basically that, along with several other works that he wrote and all that kind of stuff, is that he wrote them because of his excitement and enthusiasm or whatever for essentially the genre. I mean, it's basically Wild Card got started by he and the some other authors essentially sitting down and coming up with their own role playing game and developing characters and stuff. And that's just a far cry from. There are definitely some authors or whatever, and not to take anything away from them or whatever, but there are some that I've heard interviews or different things like that where I don't necessarily know that they have the same kind of say like passion or excitement. And I thought that was just a really interesting thing and a reassuring thing on some level. I mean, obviously people have the worries about how long it's taken them to finish Saga of Ice and Fire, but it definitely makes me feel confident that a lot of it's because he does feel so strongly about it, so much has so much passion for it, that it's important to get it right, and it's important for it to be there and not just be an author who's turning out a book every 6 months without being concerned about the bigger picture of it.
Yeah, and it's kind of cool to see that, because just as it's kind of fun to me to see people applying their craft in kind of a challenging aspect, like, well, what if I try this genre? What if I do this? Like, I don't want to say it was one of my favorite reading experiences, but I was really glad I read it, was the book Eaters of the Dead by Michael Crichton. Eaters of the Dead was turned into the movie The 13th Warrior with Antonio Banderas. I really liked the movie. The book, I was like, oh, it's based on the book. I'll read the book. That's awesome. Not so much. That book was basically a exercise, or something that he did with one of his writer buddies on a dare, so to speak, of writing sort of it's more like a exercise on the Beowulf legend. If the Beowulf and Grendel legend was based on a real event, what would that real event look like? And so the book ends up being a very historical, kind of dry tale, not full of embellishment, or really, it's not really a cohesive narrative of one man's journey through Viking-occupied lands, and him recording what he sees. And what he sees eventually is the historical event that gets embellished into the Beowulf and Grendel story. So, very cool concept. Maybe not that great to read, but I'm still really glad that he did it. It's kind of like a concept album or something that, I'm glad someone's playing around and trying weird stuff, even if it doesn't end up with a great product, because it might do something in some way to kind of advance the genre or advance somebody's perception of what you can do in a book or a novel. Now, I say all of that, and I haven't read Wild Cards, which I hear anecdotally is not that good, but I still want to check it out. And so it may be terrible. I have no idea, but I don't know. Now I'm all hyped up for more George R. R. Martin works. So
yeah, that's same here. It definitely got me in really excited. This is like a little thing, but I find it like a little interesting, is that the Dunk and Egg stories were, I mean, barely touched on. There was just a little. They did have a copy of I believe it was the Hedge Knight comic book, and there may have been like one other mention of it, but it was not put in with the Song of Ice and Fire part of the exhibit. It was definitely put in with the section of Martin's other works, and I thought that was kind of not like hugely interesting, but I thought it was kind of interesting. Decision to keep it separate, even though it's definitely part of the world of Ice and Fire.
Yeah, because you've now caught up, right? You've read all through the Mystery Knight. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And see, to me, that's the most recent thing. I read all the books, and then I read the Dunk and Egg stories. Like, I love the Dunk and Egg stories, and I can kind of understand like when he announces something, or announces something like the most recent one was something for not the Lands of Ice and Fire, but the big kind of compendium coffee table style book that's coming out next year.
World of Ice and Fire?
Yeah, that's what it is. he announces lots of stuff for that. And I can kind of understand like getting a little bit away from the huge elephant you have to eat one bite at a time and being able to tell a different story and apply himself. And as long as he's interested and energized by it, like, and he can write Dunk and Egg and he can write World of Ice and Fire, that's fine with me. I mean, I eventually want him to finish Winds of Winter, obviously, but it's kind of just showing that it kind of seeing all of his works there and just the wide variety of stuff he's done from, a lot of the things that are, everybody knows that he worked on Beauty and the Beast, but I mean, just to see all the other stuff he got involved in, like the whole Princess of Mars script that he was working on, or screenplay.
Right.
I had no idea. I mean, I had no idea who was doing at one point was involved in that. And just to think that that was something that he had put together, and I think it was a collaborative effort too, and I don't remember who he was working with that on, but eventually, the studio that owned that or had rights to the property, it eventually became the John Carter flop. But I mean, George had nothing to do with that, but just to think he was attached to, that property at one point, creating work for it that just never saw the light of day. I was like, man, that's wild. That blows my mind.
Right. We should also, I mean, we've mentioned all the things that, of Martin. I feel like we should, just because they involve people that are big on the, or have a big connection to the podcast of Ice and Fire. I thought it was neat that the Feast of Ice and Fire was included. They had that book in there.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like that's. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, and then also that they had the Beyond the Wall book in there. I haven't read it yet, but that's something that I know has been at least mentioned on the podcast before, and that like, so they included kind of these other books, other works that really kind of add to the information about the Song of Ice and Fire.
It is really cool because they did seem like they did a good job. Like the kind of subheading of the Deeper Than Swords exhibit is celebrating the work of George R.R. Martin, and so in doing that, they're actually showing like ways that other people are celebrating it, basically. And so that was really cool to see. And I had forgotten that those were in there, so I'm glad that you mentioned it. But I mentioned the Land of Ice and Fire. I got that mixed up with the World of Ice and Fire. They actually had big printouts from the Land in Ice and Fire there as well. So you could, look at those if you hadn't gotten the book or anything like that. You could see that stuff. They had that up on the walls too, which was really cool.
Yep. Well, I think we've probably exhausted most of the stuff that was included up in there, up in the exhibit.
Yeah, pretty much. I think we covered a lot of things. I'm kind of thumbing through the pictures. One thing I didn't mention was they had the, another print. They had a print of Sansa and the Hound, which was really, I thought it was really cool just because, the Hound in the HBO series is notably a bit older than what one would expect. And so it was kind of cool to see, the younger version and more scarred version of the Hound, just because, in case you hadn't seen that already. That was cool. I think that was most everything.
Yeah, I did want to mention, because I mentioned it when we were there, the one artwork that they had, or the one painting that they had of the Hound and Sansa would definitely be something that any Sand shippers should check out. There was definitely some sexual tension going on in that one, I believe.
Just a little bit.
I did one other thing that I thought was interesting, just going back to your thing of like the different depictions. I thought it was jarring at first, but just overall just interesting, is that Sandor's scars in the painting were on the opposite side from what they are on the HBO show. And I thought that was just, not a huge thing, but it was kind of interesting.
I did not notice that, so you get points, man. You get a gold star.
Thanks.
So something that we haven't mentioned yet, but was really cool, is that in addition to just getting into the exhibit for free, they have these little printouts on like postcards or whatever of some of the scenes and pictures from the 2012 Song of Ice and Fire calendar. So that was cool. And something they also gave you was actually like a bound book that I'm holding in my hands right now that is basically a summary of the exhibit. And so lots of the history and lots of the stuff that Brian and I were talking about is actually contained in this book. And I probably should have been thumbing through it more than I was during the podcast so I could have it. But it's basically a nice little, it has kind of some shots and some pictures of some of the things we were talking about. So if one is able to get down to College Station, I mean, it is well worth the price of admission, which is free because you get goodies, and the actual whole exhibit was pretty cool. Now, it's worth noting that they didn't have very many of these up in the exhibit. They only had about 6 or 8 just laying on a table near the elevator. So I wasn't entirely too sure if you had to pay for them, if they were free. I wasn't sure because there's only like a few lying there. And so I was like, well, you know what? No big deal. I'll just go downstairs and I'll ask the nice lady working at the counter in the front what the deal is. Now, I don't think I really mentioned it before, but Brian, you can confirm this, that the initial, for whatever reason, when we walked into the library in the very, as soon as we got there, I didn't really have a natural interaction with this person.
No, it was pretty. It was pretty awkward. It's kind of your way, Travis. Not anything. In a lot of cases, not necessarily anything explicitly that you do. There's just tends to be some awkwardness in interaction with random people.
Yeah, and it's not like it's like just a series of misunderstandings just lead to a moment of tension where we're just waiting for the other person to talk or something. And like as soon as I walked in, I was looking at something on the display that they had up there for it. She's like, are you here for the exhibit? And I didn't pay attention to her because my mind was elsewhere. I saw something shiny and I was looking at it. So I turned back and I was like, yeah, hi, where's the exhibit at? And like just completely not even addressing the thing that she mentioned. And that just kind of made things awkward. And then I just like kind of strolled off and she was like, no, you got to put your bags up and here's the locker. And I'm like, well, and she kind of pointed generally. I was like, well, where are the lockers? And she was trying to tell me in the moment that I was asking. And so it was just like that sort of walking all over someone else's conversation type train wreck. And so this is important because when we go back downstairs, we're going to get our stuff out of the lockers and we're going to walk out. And I'm like, damn it, I am not going to be awkward. This is not the way it's going to be. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to get me back to zero here. Get me back to a baseline. And I wanted to ask about this awesome bound program of sorts. That's probably the best way to refer to it as program. And that's really what I should have done.
Yeah, but for clarification, it's nicely bound. It's on, good like kind of cardstock. It's full color. It's got like several like kind of essays in it. So it's not just simply like, it's not a program in the sense that it's like a,
it's not
say 8 pages of just, telling you what this is or whatever.
No, it's not a baseball program. It's not like something that's thin and glossy and shitty. And then like, you're just going to get a bunch of ads for like Ozarka water in it. No, it's pretty nice. It's about half an inch thick, maybe. Like it's a good little book. So
yeah, it's almost 100 pages. So,
and it's free. So we go back downstairs, and I'm going to ask, hey, those awesome little programs, those little exhibit books, like, can I buy one of those? How do I want to take this home with me? So, but that's not what I said. And what I said was, I walked up to her, and Brian is hanging back behind me, offering me no help whatsoever. He's just content to watch this whole thing burn. I walk up to her and I said, hey, those books upstairs, can I buy one of those?
And keep in mind that upstairs, where we were, there are cases and cases of rare books from Song of Ice and Fire series, like rare editions, in some cases one-of-a-kind editions.
So this poor lady is looking at me like I'm just the idiot who walked in and asked to buy like the exhibit. Like, I want to buy, yes, that one, like George's manuscript. Can I buy that version of it, please? And she looks at me and she's just like, no, you can't, like, And it took me a second to like, well, they were just sitting out there on the table. They looked like I was supposed to take one. And then, not very observant, then I kind of start looking towards the exit because now I'm starting to like panic, look around, like left to the right of, oh, someone help me out. What happens here now? And I notice upstairs there was like 6 or 7 or 8. Downstairs, there's literally like 200 of these things stacked near the door, like just make easy exit, just sitting there. And I kind of look, and I'm so glad I looked because like I can only imagine where the conversation would have gone. Like if I started getting really irate, like, no, I want to take one of these home so I can remember it. It like, that's when security gets called. But no, there's this whole stack. And so I go, oh no, these books, like the programs, is she like a huge stack of books. It's like the stack of cash and like that the Joker was sitting on in The Dark Knight. Like that's how it's just very obviously for taking. She goes, oh yeah, take those. Yes. And I turned around and Brian, who had been silent this entire time, is just struggling to keep from just bursting out into laughter. I'm just like, you asshole. You knew what was happening.
I did.
You knew, and you did nothing. You did not help me at all.
Yep.
So I went into this thing. I went downstairs like purely with the goal of just repairing, the societal fabric between me and this person, and I just ripped it asunder. There is no going back now.
Yeah, it was pretty great. It was a nice end to like a really, really cool museum exhibit.
Would you say it was a nice bookend?
I would not, because I'm not a hack.
Yeah. Well, to kind of a nice thing in closing, because we're talking about like, a few things of how the exhibit kind of expanded and included some of the stuff like the Feast of Ice and Fire book and everything. We took a stroll through the Student Center at A&M, which is really cool. And they actually have, at the bookstore in there, they actually have all the works of A Song of Ice and Fire. So you can buy the graphic novel, you can buy Game of Thrones through Dance with Dragons. And so it was kind of cool to see that, and it actually had pretty prominent display in one of the windows. Like, you had the exhibit, you had like the intellectual and the history side of it all, and then you could turn around and, go actually buy the product, which I thought was cool. Like I'm cool with kind of advertising it and selling it and getting more people into the books. And so if that happens, then great, man. Sell away.
Yeah, I agree. Overall, it was a great trip. Even before we went and got to go drink some cheap beer afterwards. So, yeah, overall a rousing success.
Yeah. I mean, we were a little concerned initially, like if it was going to be worth a trip, but absolutely. If you're in Texas, if you can get to College Station in about, 4 or 5 hours, I mean, it's worth making a day of it. And, there's plenty of things to do. Also in College Station, it may not look like it, but man, cheap beer, dude, like so cheap beer. It was awesome. Like the expensive beer was like $3.25. Yeah.
It was just real quick too from the program. I read some of it the other day, and it had a little bit of information on basically how Martin's archives ended up at A&M, and it actually goes back to the mid '80s. Apparently, A&M has, according to this, it's the oldest student-run con in the United States. Run just by college students, and it goes back to it's called AggieCon, and it goes back to 1969. But they would do events and everything, and they had in the 80s had George R. R. Martin at one of the events. So obviously this predates Song of Ice and Fire would have been based on his other writings, but he came out and I guess developed a friendship with a student that was there, and eventually I guess that student went on to work at the library and encouraged Martin to donate his manuscripts. I may be getting some of these details not exactly right. Apparently Martin loves Texas barbecue.
Oh, that's awesome.
And this student who went on to work at the library would actually ship barbecue out to New Mexico for Martin Texas barbecue because Martin complained that he couldn't get good barbecue in New Mexico. So yeah, he'd like ship it in like, on dry ice, which I thought was kind of a little bit of a funny story. But yeah, so if you come to Texas just for this exhibit, which I'm not necessarily saying it's that great of an exhibit, but if you do, you should also get some Texas barbecue.
Definitely. So yeah, beers at the Dixie Chicken, barbecue at, there's plenty of places. So, all right. Well, awesome. I think that's going to do it for this. If you listen to this, awesome. Thank you. And I guess keep listening to Podcasts of Ice and Fire. Keep listening to the Vassals of Kingsgrave. Keep listening to the Bastards of Kingsgrave, because it seems like just more and more podcasts are being put together, and that's awesome. So, also, and also I'm going to be putting up pictures on the forums. So you should join the forums if you're not on the forums. And my name on the forums is TravisoTraviso, all together.
And mine is Ikswarum, IKSWARUM.
All right. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.
Bye. There may be some fat that can be trimmed out of that. I feel like there was one point where I rambled a little bit, and
oh yeah.
But the thing is that I have no idea about, and part of it is
I'll clean it up.
There was one point where I was in the middle of talking, and I'm like, I have no idea what I'm saying. For the most part, I wasn't too tired, but there was one moment. So if you're listening to something and you're like, what the hell is Brian saying here? You can feel free to cut that section out or whatever. So
yeah. Well, we'll see. Let's save the best part of that for, I guess, the end of the podcast.
The best part? What do you mean the best part?
The part where I basically ask her if I can steal the exhibit.
Oh. Yeah, that was a good part. You there?
I'm here.
Oh.
I'm tweeting.
Like a lot of like whoosh, whoosh. But I don't know if that's just like it's not happening now, but it was definitely happening before. I like that now you're talking in normal Travis voice.
Oh, what was I talking like before?
You were kind of in your NPR voice.
Damn it. I thought I was not going to get into that today.
It's not I don't think it was as bad as BSG, but as the BSG one, which it's not that it's horrible. It's like if people didn't know you, they're not going to really notice. But
see, that's why
voice.
That's why I just need to drink while we do these. I didn't drink any tonight.
Yeah, you do need to drink.
If I drink, then it takes that filter away. You get unfiltered, Travis.
Yeah. So other than editing, you got anything going on this weekend?
Parents, man. Parents are in town doing a thing, birthday thing for my brother on Saturday. Honestly, I probably won't get to editing until Sunday. So,
but not a big deal either way. All right, have a good one.
All right, cool.
Bye.
We'll see ya. Don't let me stop you, man. Keep going.
No, I'm good.